Imagine walking into a courthouse to deliver justice, only to be stopped at the door, accused of being a suspect in the very system you fought to fix. Judge Carmen Banks faces this reality. On the same day, she presides over a case of racial profiling that could shake the foundations of law enforcement. What unfolds next reveals not just one officer's bias, but the dark, hidden threads of a broken system that countless others are trapped in. Before we dive into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching or listening from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Carmen Banks was already late. Her heels echoed loudly on the concrete as she rushed through the parking lot toward the courthouse in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It was one of those muggy southern mornings where the air felt too thick to breathe, and her head pounded with the weight of what today could mean. It wasn't just another day for her. This was the case that could change everything. The kind of trial that could make headlines or shake the foundation of the justice system in the state. She glanced at the courthouse, a massive building she had walked into countless times before. But today felt different, almost like she was walking into battle. Her reflection in the glass caught her attention for a brief second. Tall and poised, Carmen looked every bit the seasoned judge she had become over the years. But inside, she felt the familiar pull of anxiety in her chest. "Focus," she whispered under her breath, straightening her back. There was no room for hesitation. Not today. The case she was presiding over was not just another hearing. A young man named Terrence Daniels had been arrested under questionable circumstances, right outside his own apartment complex. The officers involved claimed he matched the description, a phrase Carmen had heard more times than she cared to remember. The familiarity of those words always stirred something painful in her. She knew all too well how easily those words could be thrown around to justify actions rooted in prejudice. Today, it was her job to ensure justice was served, but a personal stake also hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. As she crossed the parking lot, Carmen made a mental note of the time. She was cutting it close, only 10 minutes left until court was in session. Her pulse quickened at the thought of the media circus gathering outside. Reporters were already camping at the main entrance, eager to cover what had become a highly publicized case. The whole city was watching, and beyond that, much of the country was paying attention too. She turned toward the side entrance, hoping to avoid the chaos outside. As she approached, her fingers instinctively reached for the ID badge hanging from her neck. It was part of her routine, one she had done 1,000 times before, but before she could even display it, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," a man's voice demanded. Carmen looked up and found a young police officer standing rigidly in front of the door. He was white, in his mid-20s, and his eyes were fixed on her in a way that immediately set off alarms in her mind. It wasn't the first time she had felt that look, a mixture of suspicion and something she couldn't quite put into words. "I'm Judge Banks," she replied, holding up her badge. He didn't even glance at the badge. Instead, he stood there, sizing her up as if she were a criminal caught red-handed. "There's been an incident nearby," the officer said, his hand now hovering near his belt. "And you match the description of someone we're looking for." Carmen felt her breath catch for a moment, disbelief washing over her. She was standing in front of the courthouse where she had worked for years, and this young officer couldn't even bother to look at her badge? The weight of his words settled in her chest. She knew exactly what he meant when he said, "You match the description." It was the same tired excuse used far too often. Her heart pounded, but her face remained calm. She had been in this position before, and reacting emotionally would only escalate the situation. "I'm here for a trial," she said evenly, extending the badge toward him again. "And I'm already late." The officer, whose name tag read Taylor, didn't flinch. His hand was still hovering near his belt, dangerously close to the handcuffs clipped to his waist. "Doesn't matter who you say you are. You're going to have to answer a few questions before I let you through." Carmen's patience was wearing thin. There wasn't time for this. Her entire career had been built on ensuring justice, and here she was, standing outside the courthouse, facing the very bias she had been fighting against her whole life. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on her. Before she could respond, another voice broke the tension. What's going on here? Both Carmen and Officer Taylor turned to see an older black officer walking toward them. His face was lined with age and experience, and there was a hint of disbelief in his eyes as he recognized Carmen. "Judge Banks?" he asked, his voice a mixture of concern and surprise. "Yes," Carmen responded, relieved to see a familiar face. "I'm just trying to get inside." The older officer shot a glance at Taylor, who still hadn't moved. "Stand down," he ordered, his tone firm. "She's the judge for the Daniels case." Officer Taylor's expression shifted slightly, but he was still reluctant. "She matches the description of—" "That's the judge," the older officer interrupted, his voice sharp. "You're making a mistake." Taylor finally backed off, muttering something under his breath. Carmen exhaled slowly, trying to push down the anger building inside her. She nodded at the older officer in gratitude before walking past them and entering the courthouse. Inside, the sterile walls greeted her with a familiarity that should have felt comforting. But today, they felt cold. The exchange outside had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. She had been fighting battles like these her whole life, but the exhaustion of it all was starting to settle in deep. She walked toward the courtroom, gathering her thoughts. She couldn't afford to let the incident affect her. The trial was about to start, and all eyes would be on her to deliver justice in a case that had already divided public opinion. The courtroom was packed when she entered. Reporters lined the back, their pens ready, and the jury sat quietly, waiting for her to call the session to order. At the defense table sat Terrence Daniels, the young man at the center of the trial. He was no older than 25, with a look of exhaustion and defeat etched across his face. Next to him was his lawyer, a woman who appeared equally tense. Carmen took her seat at the bench, her gavel heavy in her hand as she called the court to order. The opening statements began, but her mind kept drifting back to the encounter outside. It wasn't the first time she had been judged not by her qualifications, but by the color of her skin, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But today, it wasn't about her. It was about Terrence Daniels, about the countless people like him who had been wrongfully accused, humiliated, and tossed aside by a system that refused to see them as anything but suspects. The prosecution's case was strong. They presented witness after witness, each one painting a clearer picture of how Terrence had been stopped, questioned, and detained simply for existing in a place where someone like him wasn't expected to be. His only crime had been walking home after a long shift at work. Terrence himself took the stand, and his voice cracked with emotion as he described the night of his arrest. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Terrence said, his eyes avoiding the gaze of the jury. "I was just trying to get home. I didn't even know why they were stopping me. I kept asking, but they wouldn't tell me. They just assumed." Carmen leaned forward slightly, her grip on the gavel tightening. She had heard stories like Terrence's before, too many times in fact, but today it felt personal. Maybe it was because of what had happened outside with Officer Taylor, or maybe it was the way Terrence's voice trembled as he spoke, a mixture of fear and disbelief. Either way, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Midway through Terrence's testimony, the door to the courtroom creaked open. Carmen's heart sank as she saw Officer Taylor enter, his face pale and tense. He made his way to the witness stand, and Carmen's eyes followed him, every nerve in her body on edge. Taylor took the stand, his movements stiff and awkward. Gone was the confident posture from earlier. Now, he looked nervous, his eyes flickering around the room as if searching for an escape. The prosecutor approached, her voice sharp as she began her questioning. "Officer Taylor, can you describe the events leading up to the arrest of Terrence Daniels?" Taylor shifted in his seat, his voice lacking the confidence he had shown outside. "I was patrolling the area, and I saw Daniels. He looked out of place." There it was again, those words that Carmen had come to hate. Out of place. It was code, and everyone in the room knew it. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Officer Taylor fidgeted in his seat. His earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that he was under intense scrutiny. Carmen's gaze remained fixed on him, her fingers subtly tapping the edge of her gavel as she listened to his hesitant testimony. "I'm sorry, Officer Taylor," the prosecutor said, cutting through the growing unease in the room. "Could you clarify what you mean by out of place? What exactly about Mr. Daniels made him seem suspicious to you?" Taylor hesitated. The pause seemed to stretch on forever. Carmen watched as his eyes shifted nervously from the prosecutor to the jury, and finally to the defense table where Terrence Daniels sat, his face impassive, but his hands clenched tightly together. He was acting nervous," Taylor finally responded, his voice wavering, looking around like he was up to something. The prosecutor arched an eyebrow. "And what exactly was Mr. Daniels doing when you first saw him?" "He was waiting," Taylor replied, his discomfort growing by the second. "He was just standing there, like he was waiting for someone." The prosecutor's tone sharpened. "So, standing and waiting is suspicious behavior now?" Taylor swallowed hard, his face flushing. It wasn't just that. It was the way he was looking around, like he didn't belong there. Carmen's grip on her gavel tightened. The phrase hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone in the room. Didn't belong. It was the same justification she had heard time and time again, an excuse that had been used to criminalize innocent black men and women for simply existing. The prosecutor leaned in closer, her voice cold. "Officer Taylor, I want to be very clear. You stopped Mr. Daniels because he was standing in his own neighborhood, waiting for a ride share. Correct?" Taylor's face turned a deeper shade of red. I thought, "Answer the question, officer," the prosecutor demanded, her patience wearing thin. Taylor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yes." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Carmen glanced toward the jury, watching their reactions carefully. Some of them were clearly moved by the testimony, their faces reflecting a growing awareness of the injustice that had taken place. Others, however, seemed conflicted, as if struggling to reconcile their preconceptions with the harsh reality being laid out before them. The prosecutor pressed on, her voice relentless. "And during your search of Mr. Daniels, did you find anything at all, that would suggest he was involved in criminal activity?" Taylor hesitated again, his eyes darting toward the defense table. "No," he finally admitted. "We didn't find anything." The prosecutor nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Taylor's face. "So, to summarize, Mr. Daniels was standing in his neighborhood, waiting for a ride, and you arrested him because he looked out of place. Is that correct, Officer Taylor?" Taylor's silence was answer enough. The prosecutor straightened, her voice ringing out clearly for everyone in the courtroom to hear. "No further questions, Your Honor." Carmen's eyes remained on Taylor as he stepped down from the stand, his once confident demeanor now reduced to a shadow of itself. As he returned to his seat, Carmen couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. It wasn't just about Taylor. He was a symptom of a much larger problem, a problem that had been allowed to fester within the very system she had sworn to uphold. But today, she had the power to do something about it. Today, she could make sure that justice was served. The trial continued, with both sides presenting their closing arguments. The defense attorney made an attempt to paint Officer Taylor as a well-meaning cop who had made an honest mistake. But Carmen could see through the weak arguments, and so could the jury. The prosecutor, on the other hand, was forceful and clear in her message. This wasn't just about one man's wrongful arrest. It was about a pattern of racial profiling that had gone unchecked for far too long. When the jury finally left to deliberate, the courtroom remained silent, the tension still thick in the air. Carmen leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had seen this story play out before, countless times. It was a cycle, one that never seemed to end. And then, just as Carmen was beginning to settle into the wait, the door to the courtroom creaked open again. Officer Taylor walked back in, his face pale, his steps hesitant. Carmen's eyes followed him as he approached the defense table, but instead of sitting down, he made his way toward the bench. Carmen's heart raced as she watched him, unsure of what was about to happen. "Your Honor," Taylor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "May I speak?" Carmen hesitated for a moment, studying his face. He looked different now, smaller somehow, as if the weight of what had transpired had finally settled on his shoulders. "You may," Carmen replied, her voice steady. Taylor cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. I made a mistake," he said, his words halting. "I let my assumptions, my prejudices get the better of me. I thought I was protecting the community, but I was wrong. I see that now." The courtroom was completely still, every eye fixed on Taylor as he continued. "I didn't realize what I was doing at the time, but I know I hurt Mr. Daniels. I know I let my biases cloud my judgment, and for that, I'm sorry." Carmen's chest tightened as she listened to his apology. It was heartfelt, yes, but it wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough to undo what had been done, to heal the damage that had been caused. Taylor's voice cracked as he continued, his gaze falling to the floor. "I wish I could take it back. I wish I could go back and make things right. But I can't. All I can do now is apologize and try to be better." For a long moment, Carmen said nothing. She simply watched him. The young officer who had once stood so tall and proud, now reduced to a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but firm. "Your apology is noted, Officer Taylor. But understand this. The harm caused by your actions, by actions like yours, runs deep. It doesn't just affect one man. It affects entire communities." Taylor nodded, his face pale and drawn. "I know." Carmen's gaze never wavered. "It's not enough to be sorry, officer. Real change requires more than that. It requires accountability. It requires action." Taylor swallowed hard, his eyes downcast. "I understand." With that, Carmen dismissed him, her mind already turning to what lay ahead. The jury would return soon, and with them would come the final verdict. But Carmen knew that no matter the outcome, the fight for justice was far from over. The courtroom remained silent as Taylor exited, the door closing softly behind him. Carmen glanced at the clock, the minutes ticking by at an agonizingly slow pace. She could hear the distant murmurs of the reporters outside, their pens and cameras ready to capture the outcome of this case. When the door to the jury room finally opened, Carmen sat up a little straighter. The jurors filed in, their expressions guarded, their eyes fixed ahead as they took their seats. The room was charged with anticipation, every person holding their breath as the jury foreman rose to deliver the verdict. Carmen's heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm, her hands steady as she turned to the foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged woman with dark hair, nodded once, her hands trembling slightly as she held the slip of paper. "We have, Your Honor." Carmen took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering as the foreman began to read. "In the case of Officer Michael Taylor, we find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." The words seemed to echo in the room, a ripple of emotion sweeping through the courtroom. Carmen glanced at Terrence Daniels, who sat frozen in his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. Slowly, the realization of what had just happened washed over him, and tears welled up in his eyes as his lawyer placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Across the room, Officer Taylor stood still, his face pale, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. The weight of the verdict had clearly hit him, and for a moment, Carmen thought he might collapse under its force. But he remained standing, his eyes fixed on the floor as the reality of his actions settled in. Carmen banged her gavel once, her voice clear and steady as she called the court to adjourn. The room erupted into chaos as reporters scrambled for the exits, eager to be the first to break the news. Terrence's family rushed to his side, hugging him tightly as he fought to hold back his tears. But Carmen remained seated, her gaze drifting toward Officer Taylor as he slowly made his way toward the door. He paused for a moment, glancing back at her with a look of remorse and defeat, before he finally stepped out of the courtroom. As the courtroom emptied, the gravity of the moment hung in the air. Carmen remained seated at the bench, her mind swirling with thoughts. She had seen justice served today, but it didn't feel like the victory she had hoped for. The verdict was a step in the right direction, but she knew all too well that this case was just one in an endless cycle. Terrence Daniels had received some semblance of justice, but for every Terrence, there were countless others whose stories would never make it to a courtroom. And that was the weight that sat heavily on Carmen's shoulders as she sat alone in the now empty room. She glanced up as the door to the courtroom creaked open once more. It was Sergeant Isaac Harris, the older black officer who had intervened earlier with Officer Taylor. His face was lined with exhaustion, but there was something else in his expression, a quiet determination that Carmen recognized immediately. He approached the bench slowly, his eyes filled with concern. "Judge Banks," Harris said softly, "may I have a word?" Carmen nodded, gesturing for him to sit. She appreciated his calm presence, especially after the tension of the trial. Harris sat down across from her, folding his hands in front of him. "I just wanted to thank you," Harris began, his voice low, "for handling this case the way you did. You held us accountable, and that's exactly what we need." Carmen let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. "I appreciate that, Sergeant, but it doesn't feel like enough. This was just one case, and there are so many more out there. So many people who don't get justice." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, but that's why we have to keep pushing. This case may not change everything, but it's a step forward, and every step forward matters." Carmen sighed, her gaze drifting to the empty seats in the courtroom. "It just feels like we're fighting an uphill battle, one that never ends." Harris leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "That's because we are, but that doesn't mean we stop fighting." Carmen met his gaze, seeing the same weariness she felt reflected in his eyes. Harris had been in law enforcement for decades, and she knew he had seen more than his fair share of the injustices they were up against. Yet, despite it all, he still believed in the possibility of change, and that, in itself, was a small comfort. "What about Taylor?" Carmen asked quietly. "What happens to officers like him, ones who have been taught to see things a certain way?" Harris exhaled, his expression grim. "It's hard. There are a lot of officers like him, ones who don't even realize the biases they carry. But there are also people like me, trying to change things from the inside. I can't promise it'll be easy, and I can't promise we'll fix everything. But I'll keep trying for as long as I can." Carmen nodded slowly, though the weight of responsibility still pressed heavily on her shoulders. The trial had been exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but the fight was far from over. There would be more cases, more people like Terrence Daniels who would need her help, and she couldn't afford to lose hope, not yet. Harris rose from his seat, offering her a small, respectful nod. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. That's how we change things, piece by piece." Carmen watched as he walked toward the door, his steps slow but purposeful. She remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the empty courtroom as her thoughts raced. The fight for justice wasn't something that could be won overnight. It was a long, arduous journey, but today had been a step forward. And that, she thought, was how change began. The next morning, the courthouse was buzzing with anticipation. The jury had reached its decision, and news outlets from across the country were eagerly waiting for the final word on the trial. Carmen sat in her chambers, the hum of activity outside muffled by the thick walls. She sipped her coffee slowly, staring at the case files scattered across her desk. This case, and everything that had transpired, felt like a turning point. Outside, the reporters and protesters had gathered again. The air was thick with tension, and Carmen could sense the weight of expectation pressing down on the courthouse. This wasn't just a local story anymore. It had become a national symbol of the ongoing struggle against racial injustice in law enforcement. The trial of Terrence Daniels had struck a chord, and now all eyes were on her courtroom. Carmen's mind wandered back to the events of the previous day. Officer Taylor's apology still lingered in her thoughts, though she knew it couldn't undo the harm he had caused. His words had been sincere, but they were not enough to erase the deep-rooted biases that had led to Terrence's wrongful arrest. And that was the crux of the issue. Taylor wasn't an anomaly. He was a product of a flawed system, one that Carmen had dedicated her life to challenging. There was a knock on her door, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. Her clerk, a young woman named Emily, entered the room holding a slim folder. Her expression was serious, but Carmen could see the tension in her eyes. "The jury's ready," Emily said softly. Carmen nodded, rising from her chair and smoothing the front of her robe. "Let's do this." As she made her way to the courtroom, the sound of her footsteps echoed down the long, empty hallway. The courthouse felt different today. The usual hum of activity had been replaced by an almost oppressive stillness, as if everyone was holding their breath in anticipation of the verdict. Carmen could feel the weight of it pressing in from all sides, but she pushed the feeling aside. Today wasn't about her. It was about delivering justice, and that was all that mattered. When she entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was stifling. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras poised and ready to capture the moment. The families of both Terrence Daniels and Officer Taylor sat in the front rows, their faces tense with anxiety. Carmen took her place at the bench, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Terrence. He sat with his lawyer at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him. His face was calm, but Carmen could see the exhaustion in his eyes. It had been a long, grueling trial, and the emotional toll was evident in the way he carried himself. But there was also a glint of hope in his expression, a hope that today, justice would finally be served. Carmen's gaze shifted to Officer Taylor. He looked far less sure of himself than he had the day before. His eyes darted nervously around the room, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched the edge of the table. For the first time since the trial began, he looked small, like a man who had finally realized he couldn't outrun the consequences of his actions. "Please bring in the jury," Carmen said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and the 12 jurors filed in. Carmen watched them carefully as they took their seats, her heart pounding in her chest despite her outward composure. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, held a slip of paper in her hand, clutching it as if it were a lifeline. Carmen nodded toward her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman rose from her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor," she replied, her voice trembling just enough to betray the gravity of the moment. "Please read the verdict," Carmen instructed, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The foreman glanced down at the paper, then back up at the courtroom. Her voice firmed as she read the words that would change the course of this trial. "In the case of Officer Michael Taylor, we find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but it was quickly silenced by the weight of the verdict. Carmen's eyes flicked to Terrence, who sat frozen in his seat, his face a mask of disbelief. Slowly, the realization of what had just happened washed over him, and a tear slipped down his cheek. His lawyer placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, and Terrence finally allowed himself to exhale. Across the room, Officer Taylor stood motionless. His face had drained of color, and his hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. The weight of the verdict had clearly hit him hard, and Carmen could see the guilt and fear in his eyes. He had been found guilty, and there was no escaping the consequences now. Carmen banged her gavel once, her voice ringing out clearly over the murmur of the crowd. "Court is adjourned." As the reporters rushed to file their stories and the courtroom began to empty, Carmen remained seated at the bench. Her mind buzzed with the weight of what had just transpired, but there was no victory to savor. This trial may have ended, but its impact was only just beginning. For Carmen, the fight for justice wasn't confined to this courtroom. It stretched far beyond these walls, into communities still grappling with the same issues that had brought Terrence Daniels here in the first place. She had done her job today, upheld the law, presided fairly. But there was still so much more to be done. The courtroom was nearly empty now, save for a few stragglers, the families of Terrence and Officer Taylor, the attorneys quietly packing up their documents. Carmen remained seated, the weight of the gavel still resting in her hand. She had seen many cases during her career, but this one had left a deep mark, not because of its complexity, but because of what it represented, a fight for dignity in a system that too often forgot its own promises. Carmen stood slowly, her legs heavy with the exhaustion of the trial. She glanced toward the back of the courtroom, where Terrence was still sitting with his lawyer. His family had gathered around him, their quiet murmurs filled with relief and exhaustion. Terrence's eyes met hers for a brief moment, and Carmen offered him a small, reassuring nod. There was no need for words. What had happened in this room today was a small victory, but one that carried enormous weight for him. She gathered her notes and files, trying to shake off the lingering tension in her shoulders. Just as she was about to leave, she noticed someone standing near the exit. Officer Taylor. His uniform seemed too large for him now, as if the weight of the trial had shrunk him down. He leaned against the wall, his face pale and drawn, his eyes fixed on the floor. Carmen felt a pang of empathy, though she knew Taylor's remorse, however genuine, couldn't undo the damage he had caused. She started to walk past him, intending to leave without saying a word, but something in the way he looked at her, so full of regret and confusion, made her pause. "Judge Banks?" Taylor's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Carmen turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Yes?" Taylor straightened up, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, the air charged with an unspoken tension. Taylor struggled with his words, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Carmen's face remained calm, but her mind raced with memories, countless moments like this, where someone who had caused harm claimed they didn't mean for it to happen. She had heard it before, from people who thought their biases were harmless until they weren't. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" Carmen repeated, her voice cool. "But it did happen, Officer Taylor. It keeps happening to people like Terrence, to people like me. And now, you're standing here, apologizing after the damage has already been done." Taylor's face flushed with guilt. I know I screwed up. I know I let my biases get in the way. But it's not as simple as just undoing everything I've been taught." Carmen crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What changed for you now? Is it the fact that you got caught? Or is it the fact that someone finally called you out on it?" Taylor winced but didn't retreat. "Both," he admitted quietly. "I see it now, but I didn't before. I thought I was doing my job, protecting the community. But I was wrong. I see that now." Carmen took a deep breath, her eyes softening just a fraction. She had spent her entire career navigating the fine line between accountability and understanding. But today, she was tired. Tired of hearing apologies that couldn't undo the harm. Tired of a system that seemed incapable of true change. "Officer Taylor," Carmen began, her voice measured. "What you did goes beyond a mistake. It's part of a larger problem. And while I appreciate that you've come to realize your biases, I hope you understand that it's going to take more than an apology to make things right." Taylor nodded, his face full of regret. "I know. I'm going to do better. I'm going to learn from this." Carmen studied him for a moment, her mind weighing the sincerity of his words. She had seen many people come to these realizations too late. after the harm had already been done. But there was something in Taylor's demeanor that told her he was genuinely grappling with what had happened. Whether that would lead to true change remained to be seen. "I hope you do," Carmen said finally, her voice soft but firm. "Because it's people like you, people in positions of authority, who have the power to either perpetuate this problem or help dismantle it." Taylor nodded again, his eyes full of determination. "I'll keep that in mind." Carmen gave him a final look before turning and walking toward the exit. As she stepped outside into the humid Louisiana air, the weight of the conversation lingered with her. She had done her job today, but the fight was far from over. The world outside the courtroom was still riddled with injustice, and the system that had brought them all here was still broken in many ways. The media was already swarming the front entrance, their cameras and microphones ready to capture the aftermath of the trial. Carmen knew they would be looking for sound bites, for quick answers to complicated questions. But there was no simple way to explain what had happened here today, no easy way to summarize the long road ahead. Carmen opted for the side exit, hoping to avoid the crush of reporters. As she walked down the side steps, her mind drifted back to the case itself, to Terrence Daniels, the young man whose life had been upended by a simple walk home, and to all the other men and women like him who had faced similar injustices. This wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. It was just the beginning of a much larger conversation, one that would need to happen in courtrooms, police stations, and communities all over the country. As she approached her car, Carmen heard someone call her name. She turned to see Terrence walking toward her, his attorney a few steps behind. His face was calm now, though the exhaustion of the last few days was still etched in the lines around his eyes. "Judge Banks," Terrence said, his voice low but steady. "I just wanted to thank you. For everything." Carmen looked at him for a moment, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what he had endured. "You don't need to thank me, Terrence. I was just doing my job." Terrence shook his head. "No, it's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, what we go through. You gave me a voice." Carmen's chest tightened. She understood what he meant, the weight of his words sinking into her. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said carefully. "But it's just one case. We still have a long way to go." Terrence's eyes softened, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I know, but it's a start, and for that, I'm grateful." Carmen watched him walk away, his attorney following closely behind. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more left to be done. One trial, one verdict wasn't enough to dismantle a system that had been built over centuries of bias and injustice. But Terrence was right. It was a start. As she unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat, Carmen allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The road ahead was long, and the fight for justice would continue, both in and out of the courtroom. But today, at least, they had taken a step forward. Carmen drove away from the courthouse, the weight of the day still heavy on her shoulders. The city stretched out before her, a maze of streets and stories, each one shaped by the invisible lines of race, class, and history. She knew her role in this fight was far from over, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Tomorrow, the work would begin again. Tomorrow, she would continue the fight. As the courthouse receded in her rearview mirror, Carmen thought of all the other judges, lawyers, and officers scattered across the country, grappling with the same questions she had faced today. How could they rebuild a system that had been flawed from the start? How could they ensure that justice was more than just a word, but a reality for everyone? The answers wouldn't come easily, and they wouldn't come quickly. But today had been a start, and sometimes that was all they could hope for. Carmen drove in silence, the hum of the city outside blending into the rhythm of her thoughts. The streets of Baton Rouge unfolded before her in a blur, yet her mind remained anchored in the courtroom, in the faces of the people she had encountered today. Terrence, Officer Taylor, Sergeant Harris. Each of them represented a different side of the same story, one rooted in a history far older than any of them. She pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment in the quiet stillness of her car. The day had taken its toll, and exhaustion crept through her body like an unwelcome visitor. But she wasn't just physically tired. She was emotionally drained, worn down by the weight of what it meant to confront injustice head-on, day after day. As she stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, she paused to look up at the sky. It was dusk now, the last rays of sunlight fading into the horizon. The quiet of the evening offered her a rare moment of peace, and she allowed herself to breathe deeply, letting the tension in her shoulders melt away, at least for a few minutes. Inside her home, Carmen hung up her coat and slipped off her heels, the cool floor beneath her feet offering a small comfort. She moved through the house on autopilot, her mind still replaying the events of the day. The conversation with Officer Taylor lingered in her thoughts, his words echoing in her mind. "I didn't mean for this to happen." The simplicity of his statement had struck her, not because it was unusual, but because it was so common. Carmen had heard it countless times from defendants, from police officers, from people whose actions had caused harm, but who had not fully grasped the impact of their choices until it was too late. And yet, the harm had been done. Intentions, while important, couldn't undo the damage. Carmen's thoughts shifted to Terrence. She could still see the relief in his eyes, the way his shoulders had relaxed when the verdict was read. For him, today was a victory. But Carmen knew that the battle he had fought was far from unique. His case had been lucky enough to reach the courtroom, but how many others had been swept under the rug? How many people like him had been wrongfully arrested, humiliated, and cast aside without ever getting the chance to tell their story? These were the questions that haunted her. These were the questions that kept her up at night, long after the gavel had fallen and the courtroom had emptied. The next morning, Carmen awoke with the same weight pressing on her chest. The soft light of dawn filtered through her bedroom window, casting a pale glow over the room. She lay there for a moment, her mind already racing with the day ahead. There were more cases waiting for her at the courthouse, more people seeking justice, and more barriers standing in their way. She sighed and rolled out of bed, knowing that the fight would continue, whether she was ready or not. Carmen's morning routine was quick and efficient. A cup of coffee, a glance at the headlines, and a brief moment of stillness before she slipped into her professional armor. The black robe, the calm expression, the steady hands. It was a role she had perfected over the years, but one that never truly felt comfortable. Beneath the surface, she was always aware of the delicate balance she had to maintain, between empathy and impartiality, between justice and mercy. As she walked through the courthouse doors later that morning, Carmen felt the familiar rush of activity. Lawyers, clerks, and officers moved through the halls with purpose, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. She nodded at a few familiar faces as she made her way to her chambers, her mind already preparing for the cases ahead. But before she could settle into the rhythm of the day, a knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Emily, her clerk, holding a stack of papers in one hand and a slight frown on her face. "Judge Banks, there's something you might want to see," Emily said, stepping into the room. Carmen glanced up from her desk, sensing the seriousness in Emily's tone. "What is it?" Emily handed her a thin folder, her expression unreadable. "It's about Officer Taylor." Carmen's brow furrowed as she opened the folder. Inside was a report, an internal review of Taylor's conduct within the police department, specifically related to his treatment of Black and minority residents. Carmen's eyes scanned the document quickly, her stomach sinking as she read the details. This wasn't the first time Taylor had been involved in an incident like the one with Terrence. The report listed several other complaints, all eerily similar. Claims of racial profiling, unjustified stops, and confrontations that seemed to escalate without cause. And yet, despite these warnings, Taylor had remained on the force. Carmen closed the folder and sat back in her chair, her mind buzzing with frustration. How many times had this happened? How many times had someone like Taylor been given the benefit of the doubt, allowed to continue in their position despite clear evidence of misconduct? She felt a wave of anger rise in her chest, but she forced it down. This was the very system she had been working within for years, a system that allowed officers like Taylor to act with impunity, protected by layers of bureaucracy and unspoken biases. And while the verdict in Terrence's case had been a small victory, it was clear that there was still so much work to be done. Carmen leaned forward, resting her elbows on her desk. She had always known that the fight for justice was bigger than any one case, but seeing it laid out in black and white like this made the reality even harder to ignore. "Thanks for bringing this to my attention," Carmen said finally, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Emily nodded, her expression sympathetic. "What are you going to do?" Carmen let out a slow breath, her mind already working through the possibilities. "I'm going to do what I've always done. Keep pushing for change, case by case. But this needs more attention." Emily nodded again, clearly understanding the gravity of what she had just handed over. "If you need anything, just let me know." Carmen watched her leave the room, the silence settling in once again. She looked down at the folder in front of her, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. This wasn't just about Officer Taylor anymore. It was about a system that allowed people like him to operate unchecked, about a culture that excused bad behavior as long as it didn't cause too much noise. And Carmen knew that it was time to make noise. She picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. After a few rings, a voice answered on the other end. "Sergeant Harris, it's Judge Banks. I think we need to have a conversation." Later that day, Carmen found herself seated across from Sergeant Harris in a quiet corner of a local cafe. The hum of conversation around them faded into the background as they spoke, their voices low but firm. "You've seen the report on Taylor?" Carmen asked, her eyes locked on Harris. Harris nodded, his face lined with concern. "I've seen it. It's not good." "No, it's not," Carmen agreed, her frustration barely contained. "And yet he's still on the force. How is that possible?" Harris sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's the system, Judge. It's broken. Complaints get buried, investigations get delayed, and by the time anyone realizes there's a problem, it's too late. Officers like Taylor get protected because no one wants to admit there's a deeper issue." Carmen shook her head, her anger rising. "That's not acceptable, Sergeant. We can't keep allowing this to happen. People are getting hurt. Lives are being destroyed." Harris nodded, his expression grim. "I know, and I'm trying to change things from the inside, but it's not easy. The culture runs deep, and it's going to take more than a few reforms to fix it." Carmen leaned forward, her voice determined. "We need to bring this to light, Harris. People need to know what's happening. We can't just let it continue in the shadows." Harris met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, but going public with this, it's going to stir up a lot of trouble." Carmen didn't hesitate. "Good. Maybe that's exactly what we need." As Carmen sat in the cafe with Sergeant Harris, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. The problem wasn't just Officer Taylor. It was the entire culture that allowed officers like him to act with impunity. She had always known that the justice system was flawed, but seeing it up close, case after case, year after year, made her realize just how deep those flaws went. "I understand that going public with this will stir up trouble," Carmen said, her voice steady but intense. "But maybe that's exactly what we need. If the system's broken, then we need to stop pretending it's not." Harris looked at her, his eyes filled with both respect and concern. "You're right, Judge. But you need to understand that it's not going to be easy. You'll face resistance, from inside the department, from the public. People don't want to believe that the problem is this widespread." Carmen leaned back slightly, contemplating his words. She knew he was right. She had seen the way communities reacted when the truth about corruption or bias came to light. Some people were quick to denounce it, to say it was just a few bad apples, but Carmen had long since learned that the problem was far more ingrained than that. "If we don't speak up, then nothing will change, she said, her voice quieter now, more reflective. And we owe it to people like Terrence to try. Harris sighed and rubbed a hand across his jaw, clearly torn. I've been doing this for over 30 years, he said, his voice soft but heavy with experience. I've seen the good and the bad. I've watched officers come in bright-eyed and hopeful, only to become disillusioned by the system they thought they could change. I don't want you to think that one case or even one report will change everything overnight. Carmen nodded, understanding the weight of his words. I don't expect miracles, Sergeant, but I do expect progress. And that starts by bringing things like this to light. People need to see what's happening. Otherwise, we're just letting it continue in the dark. Harris met her gaze, his expression softening. I'll stand with you, Judge. I've been trying to change things from the inside for years, and if going public with this can push the needle even a little bit, then I'll help you however I can. Carmen felt a flicker of hope stir in her chest. It wasn't a solution. Not yet, but it was a start. Thank you, Harris, she said quietly. We need more people like you, people willing to stand up and call out the problem, even when it's hard. He nodded, but his expression remained somber. Just be ready, Judge. This won't be pretty, and it won't be easy. Carmen smiled faintly. Nothing worth fighting for ever is. They finished their conversation, and Carmen walked back to her car, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. Her mind buzzed with the weight of what lay ahead, but she felt more determined than ever. The trial had been a victory, yes, but it was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. If they were going to fix the system, then they would need to do more than win individual cases. They would need to dismantle the very structures that allowed those injustices to happen in the first place. That evening, Carmen sat in her living room, the glow of the television flickering in the background. The news was filled with coverage of the trial, reporters dissecting every moment, every word that had been spoken in the courtroom. But what struck Carmen most was the way people were talking about the case, as if it were an isolated incident, a single story of injustice in an otherwise functional system. She turned the volume down, her thoughts racing. How could they not see it? How could they not understand that this case wasn't the exception? It was the rule? Terrence's story wasn't unique. It was one of thousands, maybe millions, that had been pushed aside, ignored, or dismissed because it didn't fit the narrative that people wanted to believe. She reached for her phone and stared at the blank screen for a moment before dialing a number she hadn't used in a while. Carmen? The voice on the other end was familiar, but surprised. Hey, Maya, Carmen said, her voice soft but firm. I think we need to talk. Maya Williams was an investigative journalist and an old friend of Carmen's from law school. They had stayed in touch over the years, though their careers had taken them down very different paths. Carmen had always admired Maya's tenacity, her willingness to dig deep and uncover the stories that others were too afraid to tell. And if there was anyone who could help bring the truth about the systemic problems in law enforcement to light, it was her. They agreed to meet the following day, and Carmen spent the night preparing herself for what was to come. She knew that once they started down this path, there would be no turning back. But she also knew that it was the right thing to do. The next afternoon, Carmen found herself sitting across from Maya in a small, quiet coffee shop tucked away in the heart of downtown Baton Rouge. Maya looked exactly as Carmen remembered, sharp, focused, with a no-nonsense attitude that had made her one of the most respected journalists in the state. So, Maya began, her eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned forward. What's going on, Carmen? You sounded serious on the phone. Carmen took a deep breath and began to explain. She told Maya everything, about the trial, about Officer Taylor, and most importantly, about the internal report she had seen. As she spoke, she watched Maya's expression shift from curiosity to disbelief, and then finally, to quiet fury. You're telling me this isn't the first time Taylor's done this? Maya asked, her voice low and tense. Carmen nodded. There were multiple complaints. all buried or ignored. And it's not just him. This is happening all over the country. But people don't want to see it. They don't want to believe that the system is broken. Maya leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the room as she processed what Carmen had just told her. "This is big," she said finally. "I mean, we've all known about racial profiling and police misconduct. But to have proof like this, proof that the department is actively ignoring it, that's huge." "That's why I came to you," Carmen said. "I need someone who can tell this story, someone who can make people pay attention." Maya nodded, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. "I can do that. But you need to understand something, Carmen. This isn't going to be easy. Once we start digging into this, there's no going back. The department, the unions, they're going to come after you. And after me." Carmen met her gaze, her voice steady. "I know, but if we don't do this, nothing will change." Maya smiled faintly, the fire of determination flickering in her eyes. "Then let's do it. I'll start looking into Taylor's history, see if I can find any more complaints that were swept under the rug, and I'll dig into the department's internal records, see what else they've been hiding." Carmen nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. "Thank you, Maya. I knew I could count on you." Maya grinned. "You know me. I can't resist a good fight." As they parted ways, Carmen felt a sense of purpose settle over her. The path ahead would be difficult, but it was one she was ready to walk. She had spent too many years fighting for justice within the confines of the courtroom, and now it was time to take that fight beyond those walls. Over the next few weeks, Carmen and Maya worked together to uncover the full extent of the problem. Maya's investigation revealed even more troubling details. Officers with long histories of misconduct, complaints that had been ignored or dismissed, and a department that seemed more interested in protecting its own than in holding them accountable. The deeper they dug, the more Carmen realized just how vast the problem was. This wasn't just about Officer Taylor. It was about a system that had allowed people like him to thrive, unchecked, for far too long. And then, one morning, the story broke. Maya's article appeared on the front page of every major newspaper in the state, and within hours, it had gone viral. The headline was simple, but devastating. "Systemic Bias: How Baton Rouge Police Ignored Warnings and Allowed Misconduct to Flourish." The article laid everything bare: the complaints, the cover-ups, the internal reports that had been quietly filed away to avoid scrutiny. It named names, exposed the patterns of abuse, and called for immediate reform. The public outcry was swift and furious. People were shocked, angry, and demanding answers. Protests erupted outside the courthouse and police stations, with citizens calling for accountability and transparency. The department tried to contain the damage, but it was too late. The story had taken on a life of its own. Carmen watched the news unfold from her chambers, her phone buzzing constantly with messages of support and, predictably, some of anger. She knew this would happen. She had expected the backlash, the resistance, but she also knew that it was worth it. This was the kind of disruption that was needed to force change. As the days passed, more officers came forward, sharing their stories of misconduct, of being pressured to stay silent. Investigations were opened, and high-ranking officials were placed under scrutiny. The momentum was building, and for the first time in a long time, Carmen felt a glimmer of hope. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But for the first time, real change seemed possible. Carmen stood on the steps of the courthouse one evening, looking out at the crowd gathered below. People were holding signs, chanting for justice, for reform. It was a powerful sight, and one that filled her with a sense of purpose. She knew the fight was far from over. The system was deeply flawed, and it would take years, maybe decades, to fix. But today, they had taken a step forward, and sometimes that was all it took to spark a movement. As the sun set behind her, Carmen smiled to herself, feeling the weight of the day lift just a little. The road ahead was long, but for the first time she felt like they were headed in the right direction. And that, she thought, was enough.